All right, everybody, welcome back this evening. Search for Uhuru, Dynasty Mir, and I have the brother uh, Tony Morgan, who's the expert when it comes to everything. Search for
Oh,
Uhuru,
my bad.
Dynasty
Hold on.
Mir,
One second. One second.
and
Let
I
me
have
tell
the
you.
brother. Sorry about that. And I have the brother Tony Morgan, who is the expert when it comes to everything Liberia and setting the record straight when it comes to Liberia, as far as the lie that we're taught that Liberia was a failed state and it was because of Black Americans. The lie that we're told that Black Americans should not go back to Africa because of what happened to Liberia. So what we're going to do today is we're going to set the record straight on that and really speak on how Liberia was a successful nation that Black Americans should be proud of. Prior to, I would say, Samuel Doe, before he decided to pretty much, out of jealousy, uh, ruin it. So, Tony Morgan, brother Morgan, thank you so much for coming on.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes. Thanks for having me. Again. It's great the last time. I read some of the comments. They were equally mixed, or well, maybe more leaning towards the prevailing narrative of like as you said, a failed state. But first of all, you're too kind. I'm not an expert. I'm a student of history.
Okay.
But Liberia was definitely a success story, and the reason for the negative coverage, well, there are many reasons, but the main reason is Liberia, from its inception, was at the center of this debate over whether Africans could govern themselves,
Right.
independent of European rule.
Correct.
And also among Black Americans, whether or not colonization was the way to go, or whether to remain in America and fight for your birthright. The negative coverage stems from the 19th century debate over these issues. To discredit Liberia was in the interest of white supremacists, people who supported it, and people who argued that Africans needed to be colonized,
Right.
and that they couldn't govern themselves, and also in the interest of people who opposed the American colonization society and its plans to settle Black Americans in Africa. Most Black Americans opposed that plan because they felt it was a thinly disguised scheme to rid the country of free Black people. So much of the negative coverage about Liberia stems from those two issues. But today, people seem to cling to these false narratives for various reasons: political agenda, divisive agenda, and plain ignorance. And I must add a fourth: self-hatred. African self-hatred that afflicts Africans universally, whether continental or diaspora. The need to discredit our own achievements. And basically, the basic belief in white supremacy, which afflicts continental Africans and even diaspora Africans.
Right.
But if you look at Liberian history, if you study it, if you take a closer look at it and ignore forget what you've been told, study the history, research for yourself. Trace the trajectory of the country from a colonial enclave for free Black people from America, besieged by colonial forces and hostile local people that opposed their presence. If you trace that history all the way to the early 1900s, when Black Americans finally began to figure out how to include the local people, the indigenous people, fully. into the affairs of state. If you trace that trajectory all the way to the post-World War II era, when they finally realized how to do, when they finally figured out how to do it and unified the country. In the space of those 40 years, from 1945, when the unification program was launched, to 1980, when the Tolbert government was overthrown. If you look at the history just in that 40-year period, you'll be astounded at the growth, the progress that this little country of barely 3 million people made.
Right.
I mean, from economic growth and development to international prestige and being a power player on the international scene. This tiny country of oppressed African people, signatory to the United Nations and the League of Nations, co-founder of the Organization of African Unity, a voice for decolonization of Africa, a force for decolonization. A main reason why all those African countries, all those new African countries emerged in the 1960s. Liberia played a prominent role in that, in guiding and assisting all her neighbors, Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Guinea, in their transition from, to independence. Liberia provided technical assistance as well as guidance. Accra, the capital of Ghana, that city was designed by a Liberian engineer, Thomas Buchanan, who was the Secretary of Public Works in Liberia. He designed the city of Accra. They assisted Guinea. If you remember, when Guinea got its independence, they declined membership in the Francophone community. That's the community of France and its former colonies. Guinea declined membership in that, preferring to be fully independent. And because of that, France withdrew just all the technical support to Guinea, everything they took, and they stripped the bathroom sinks out of the wall. I mean, took the electrical wiring and the staples and the stationery and everything. And who stepped in to fill that void to help Guinea in its transition to independence? Liberia, his elder sister Liberia. Sékou Touré was a close friend of both President Tubman and President Talbot.
All right. Let me ask you something. People, someone in the chat room, Taffel Fall, said Liberia is the worst country in West Africa next to Guinea Conakry. Now, and I know what the answer is, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. The situation that Liberia is in now, does that have anything to do with the Americas?
Situation that is in now.
Right.
Well, it has something to do with the Americas, in as much as the Americas were Liberians. Other than that, the situation that it is in now is the result of the 1980 coup and its aftermath.
Right.
Until 1980, from, like I said before, 1945 through 1980, Liberia was a relatively prosperous and stable country.
Right.
And like I said on the last program, Liberia had a currency that was on par with the United States dollar. I don't know how much of a greater example of prosperity, one can cite. They had an emerging middle class from the 50s and 60s. It was the most prosperous country in West Africa, in that region, up until 1980. And one could argue it was one of the most prosperous countries in Africa.
Right.
And it was the most stable for 40 years, since 1945. There have been no intertribal wars, no indigenous ethnic groups fighting each other. There have been no uprisings against the government, like there have been every few years before the unification policy. Liberia was a major player on the international scene, major and respected player on the international scene. And I came by the argument that, I mean, that the Americans are responsible for the state it's in now.
Right.
The state it's in now is directly attributable to the 1980 coup, the overthrow of the Tolbert government, and its destructive aftermath. Liberia was a successful Pan-African venture, the most successful Pan-African venture in history. And one can make a strong case that's precisely the reason it was destroyed. Because as Frederick Starr cited in his book, Frederick Starr was the University of Chicago chairman of the anthropology department. And he made a trip to Liberia in 1913 to see for himself how much of a failure this country was, because that's all he had been hearing about how much of a failure Liberia was. So he went to see for himself. And his conclusion was that instead of a failure, Liberia was an astonishing success.
True.
I mean, despite the circumstances, despite the almost impossible odds against its survival as a republic, he called it a success. Despite his situation, his problems, and it was a success. And he also said, Frederick Starr also said that Liberia was a bad example to colonize Africa, because it dispelled the myth of white supremacy and the myth that Africans couldn't govern themselves. Liberia was a shining example of successful African government. And one can make a strong case that that's precisely the reason it was destroyed. It was a bad example for its neighbors. You know, when the Tolbert government was overthrown in 1980, that didn't stop with Liberia. That destabilization didn't stop with Liberia. All Liberia's neighbors fell. I mean, you saw a domino effect, a chain reaction of overthrown governments, military coups, and falling governments, because that some would argue that was a major part of the New World Order plan for that region, to get rid of the uppity Negroes that ran Liberia, because they were in the way of the plan, because they were in the way of this New World Order plan for that region, which was to instigate wars in which they could sell their arms. Instigate wars in which they could sell their arms and more cheaply exploit the natural resources. In order to do that, they had to get rid of these successful governments, these functional, competent governments, and replace them with people more easily controlled. So the 1980 coup was basically a lynching of uppity Negroes who were in the way of, the cash flow of some people.
Repeat that one more time. The coup in 1980 was what?
It was a lynching. It was a clear lynching of uppity Negroes, the uppity Negroes who ran Liberia. They were in the way of this New World Order plan for.
Okay. So let me ask you, Mr. Morgenstern, are you justifying what Doe did to Tolbert?
I'm not justifying. No, I'm explaining one of the reasons Liberia was destroyed, not because it was a failure, because it was a success.
But you
called being a success.
But you called and sorry for cutting you off. I just don't want to forget my question. You called Tolbert uppity Negro. Is that correct?
No, that was the view in which.
Oh, the view. Okay, got you. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
That's how he was viewed in certain quarters in Washington, D.C. and other foreign capitals as an uppity Negro.
Okay.
He and his entire camp, because they were people who had pride in being African and being independent, and they refused to toe the line. They were in the way of this New World Order plan for that region. And once his government was overthrown, the country reverted to what it was in 1822 when the Black Americans got there. The state obtaining at that time was basically chaos and terror for profit. All these ethnic groups just fighting each other for the benefit of a few African elites and Western capitalists. The only difference was the commodity. Back in the 19th century, the commodity was slaves. The commodity fueling this terror for profit, slaves. When the Total government was overthrown, the country reverted to that state of chaos and terror for profit and anarchy. The only difference being the commodity was no longer slaves, but natural resources. The diamonds, the gold, the timber, the iron ore, all the natural wealth of Liberia was more easily exploited for the benefit of a few warlords and the international capitalists that funded these armed factions that waged terror, that rained terror on the Liberian people.
Mm-hmm.
All of this was for profit, and the Liberians and the Togo government was in the way of this profit. That's why he was overthrown.
Let me ask you this. Now, the indigenous Liberians, so they say part of the reason why, and you somewhat touched on it, that they held the coup was because they were jealous that the Americas controlled the majority of the wealth. Is that true? Or did any of that wealth that the Americas had, did that trickle down to the indigenous population at all?
No, it's not true that the immigrant Liberians with American ancestry, controlled all the wealth or most of the wealth. That's not true. I think I alluded to this in the last program that
mm-hmm.
when the Americans got there in the 1820s, there were already wealthy people there,
right?
Wealthy in the Western sense, especially the Grebels and the Crews and the Vies. Because of centuries of trade with the Europeans, they had education, and they were already wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Vie royal clans, they were also wealthy. And then, no, this wealth was not mostly in the hands of. That is not true. That's false.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been Americans. Liberians from America may have been disproportionately wealthy, but that was for myriad reasons. One of them being that the American immigrants, when they went to Liberia, they had wealthy people among them. There was a sizable portion of upper class people among them. Mm-hmm. Who already had money when they got to Liberia, and then they became more wealthy from trade. So yes, a lot of them were wealthy disproportionately to the unassimilated people. I use the term unassimilated as opposed to native, because the ruling class itself, that is commonly referred to as the Americo-Liberian ruling class, that was an assimilated group of people of the immigrant Liberian upper class and the indigenous elites. They composed the ruling class, mm-hmm. the ruling upper class. So it's inaccurate to say that this ruling class was Americo-Liberian, or that there was such thing as an Americo-Liberian class. This was an assimilated group of people. So no, that's false. That wealth was mostly in the hands of. On a personal note, from personal experience, my maternal grandparents who raised me from birth, mm-hmm. They came from South Carolina and Virginia, and they were working class people, mm-hmm. And they paid rent. The block we lived on in Central Monrovia, half that block was owned by an indigenous person, a Vie elder who hardly spoke English. he won't have the block. My grandparents paid rent. So there's no way you could call my grandparents his oppressor. You understand? And that dispels the myth of the wealth being mostly in the hands of so-called Americo-Liberians, because half of Monrovia, Central Monrovia, is owned by indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, okay. Somebody in the chat room says the Liberian leaders were not able to clearly communicate the purpose of their policies with the natives. What are your thoughts on that statement?
There may be some element of truth to that. But the problem was not communicating the plans, the vision for Liberia, because elements of the indigenous people shared that vision of Liberia. Is the popular misconception is that these, so-called Americo-Liberians imposed Western culture on local people. But that's not true. This is a mass of cultures. This was, there were elements of the indigenous people that shared the values of the settlers. Like I said, there were already westernized people there, Gribbles, coups. And for instance, in two of the most serious wars between the Liberian government and the Gribbles, the civilized Gribble, quote unquote, civilized Gribble was the term for Gribbles that are westernized. They lived separately from the regular Gribble, from the unwesternized Gribble. And in all the wars with the Gribbles, there were many wars between the Liberian government and the Gribbles. In all those wars, the civilized Gribble, quote unquote, sided with the government against their kinsmen, their tribal kinsmen, because they shared values with the government, with their assimilated population. They were part of the assimilated population of American immigrants and indigenous people that shared this vision of a Pan-African national identity.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with unification and integration was, the obstacles to that were ignorance and lack of resources, mainly in the threat of being colonized by European power. That delayed integration and unification for 100 years. But but this was an effort of immigrants and indigenous to create African nationality based on shared values. And in the early 1900s.
I was going to ask, finish. You can answer this question after you finish your statement. But someone in the chat room want to know what part of Virginia is your family from. But go ahead and finish your statement.
I believe my maternal grandmother's people came from the Tidewater area. In the 1830s, after the Nat Turner Rebellion, that's when the ex-slaves began to go to Liberia, manumitted slaves, because the first settlers were not freed slaves at all. They were not former slaves at all. They were free Black people, some of whom had never been slaves, never had slavery in their family. But after the Nat Turner Rebellion, plantation owners began manumitting their slaves and sending them to Liberia. They were basically getting rid of the troublemakers, or potential troublemakers. And my grandmother's people were part of that, but probably came from that area, like most of the Liberians from Virginia did. But as I was saying, my regrets was that Tolbert did not continue the unification policy of President Tubman, and that's where this problem in communication probably arose. That's where I agree with your commenter that there was a failure in communication. Mm-hmm. Because if he had continued the unification policy, that would have countered the negative, divisive propaganda of the progressive opposition movements of the 1970s that would have countered the prevailing, the lingering notion that most of the power was still in the hands, that power at the highest level was still in the hands of Liberians from America. But there wasn't a failure of communicating the vision of Liberia. I think they had great success. And most of that success was due to indigenous people, the paramount chiefs, who assisted President Trump in the program. There wasn't a problem in communication. The problem was that in the 1970s, President Talbot incurred the wrath of foreign powers and who destabilized the country with these opposition movements that whose main goal was to destabilize and overthrow the government. I think we had great success in creating a shared vision between the immigrant Liberians and the indigenous Liberians.
Let me ask you.
Unified country.
Let me ask you this, Brother Morgan. Why do you think the native Liberians flopped when Doe got into power?
Why do I think they what?
They flopped.
Or why they failed?
Yeah,
they failed because the country was not ready for democracy. The two-week party conservatives insisted on a gradual approach to democracy and full inclusion because they feared that they wanted assimilation first, then democracy. That was their philosophy, because they feared that if they rushed into full inclusion and democracy without assimilation first, full assimilation first, they'll be inviting disaster, which is exactly what happened after 1980. They failed because the country was not yet ready for democracy, and they murdered all the competent leadership, the patriotic, nationalistic, competent leadership. They were all murdered by the military government in 1980. So you kill off all the leaders. I mean, you have a leadership vacuum. There's no one to fill it because everybody has run away or has been killed. And you have a group of incompetent, ignorant, illiterate people running the government. It's a no-brainer that it's going to fail. I mean, in the space of like 2 years after the military coup of 1980, the currency fell from 1-to-1 against the U.S. dollar to like a million to one is what it is right now. The rough estimate is the Liberian dollar is worth a million. $1 is worth about $1 million Liberian dollars today. Maybe less, maybe I'm exaggerating a little, but you get the idea. The economy tanked, the currency fell, the country's respect and prestige on the international scene fell. Of course it failed. I mean, it was a no-brainer that they were going to fail. The country's leadership was killed off. You have incompetent people running the government. And instead of technical assistance and investment from America, this historic development partner, Liberia's historic development partner, you get military aid, all military aid to the military government and handouts to Doe and his cronies. There's no development taking place after 1980. I mean, it's not rocket science to see why it failed. You know.
So why do you think a lot of Black people, especially Black Americans, why do you think they don't really truly research, especially the Black Americans who are about nation building? They really don't try and research what really went on in Liberia and the accomplishments we did in Liberia.
Well, most people don't research. Most people don't like to read. Most people are not very interested in history. So they like, I mean, they learn their history through sound bites, basically. And you know, the counter narrative, I mean, the negative coverage and false narratives are prominent. I mean, they're everywhere. And anytime you pick up a book about Liberia or go on the internet and research Liberia, you encounter this negative coverage. And then people just take that as the truth because, like I said, they don't like the research. They don't like the research for themselves. And then again, you have the problem of people who do know the truth, like this African American who was an ambassador. I think his name was Perkins. He was an ambassador to Liberia in the 80s under the Doe administration, and he wrote this mostly negative book. And a man with his education should know better. So you have this problem of people who know better, but still, you know, promote the prevailing false narratives. And what exacerbates that problem is that Liberian leaders fail to leave any writings behind. They fail to teach their story, to tell their story. No Liberian president ever wrote a book. None of the leaders ever wrote a book. I mean, here in America, the presidents leave their memoirs as a guide.
Exactly.
You know, presidents after them. None of this happened in Liberia. I mean, they were too busy. They were so busy struggling for survival, they didn't have time to write books. You know, and so that's a big problem, and that's what Liberian historians today, including myself, are trying to correct. I mean, but it's a very tough problem because there are no writings. For instance, on Momolu Massaquoi, he was the king of the Vai people, and he married President Johnson's granddaughter. President Hillary Johnson was the son of Elijah Johnson, one of the country's founders. Elijah Johnson was from New York, served in the War of 1812. He was a preacher, was a free man, never been a slave, and he led the first immigrants to Liberia. And his son Hillary became the 11th president of Liberia. Hillary Johnson's daughter married the Vai king, Momolu Massaquoi. That was an avenue to integration and unification, unifying the country. The Vai royal clans, including the Massaquois, married into the American immigrant upper class as a means of forging unity. Now, if Arthur Momolu Massaquoi, he was Liberian Consul General in Hamburg, Germany, you know, in the 1930s. If he had, just imagine if he had written a book. If Associate Chief Justice Nimnan Russell, who was a Grable, had written a book, you know, that would have countered a lot of this false narrative. You know, so that, I mean, that's a problem. You know, I mean, no, the leaders didn't leave any writings. So that's a main reason for a lot of this misconception and distortion. Because when you don't tell your own story, then there's a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled with assumptions and distortions and perversions and outright lies.
Someone in the chat room said, hold on one second, let me go back to it. Sophrina Powers says her great-great-grandfather was President William D. Coleman, the second best Liberian president. Some American Liberians were progressive like him and Blyton, who was actually the father of Pan-Africanism. What are your thoughts on Blyton being called the father, or being labeled the father of Pan-Africanism?
Oh yes, he was definitely, as he is referred to, the father of Pan-Africanism. He was the first to write about it. I mean, this guy was a prolific writer, and I mean, a Pan-African scholar. I mean, he spoke several indigenous languages. You know, he's born in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. And he went to Liberia as a young man, probably in his early 20s or so. And his vision of Liberia was a Pan-African state, you know, a union of American immigrants and indigenous people.
Mhm.
And he promoted that. And actually what he wanted was a genuine African state, not a Western style democracy, but a genuine African state. The problem with that was a genuine African state would not have survived because, I mean, contemporary to Liberia was the destruction of every independent West African state, the Ashanti Kingdom, Benin, then Kira, that's what's also in the Gold Coast, Mali, Ghana, every independent African state was destroyed. I mean, it took the British 100 years to defeat the Ashanti. That's how important it was to defeat to destroy independent African nations. Now, why would Liberia survive as an African state? It would not have survived. And Frederick Starr acknowledged that. Frederick Starr, the University of Chicago anthropologist I mentioned earlier, in his book, he acknowledged that Liberia would not have survived as an African state like Blyden wanted, like Edward Wilmot Blyden wanted, as great as he was. And also, Edward Wilmot Blyden was a bit of a demagogue. I mean, and that may have been because he was a politician. But I mentioned on the last program that the 1870 election was basically between the mulatto-dominated Republican Party and the True Whig Party, which Blyden co-founded, and which was made up of darker-skinned people and indigenous people and recaptive Africans. Now, Blyden exploited the colorism issue in that election. I mean, he became, he was criticized a lot, widely criticized for that, you know, as being a demagogue, not to take away in any form or fashion from his greatness. He was definitely one of the preeminent, probably the preeminent 19th century scholar, Pan-African scholar. But like I said, he had his faults like every other person. He pushed this idea of an African state without thinking it through completely, in my opinion. You know, without thinking how such a state would survive and who would protect it. You know, so he gave up. You know, he served as Secretary of State of Liberia and President of Liberia College, and then when his vision of integrating the indigenous people into Liberian society, fully into Liberian society, met with opposition and resistance from the conservatives, who feared too hasty integration and unification and full inclusion. He basically gave up on the country and moved to Sierra Leone. Now, in my opinion, that's also a mark against him. But all in all, in total, yes, I agree fully that Edward Wilmot Blyden was probably one of the greatest Pan-Africans.
All right, another question, a couple more questions. Where's it at? Oh, now, if Tolbert wasn't assassinated, you know, obviously he was assassinated, and then Doe came into power. When Doe came into power, that's when, and then you had the Civil War. That's when Liberians started to heavily immigrate into America. And now you have Trump's plan to end a program that allowed Liberian citizens in America to avoid deportation. Do you think if Tubman was not, I'm sorry, was it Tubman or Tolbert? Tubman. If Tubman was not assassinated, would Liberia be in the situation it is in today in regards to the immigration issue?
No, if Talbot had not been assassinated, if Liberia had been left alone, today we would be on par with Singapore and Brazil and all those. Yeah, we were on the verge of an economic miracle, poised for an economic miracle. And that was largely due to Mr. Talbot and his brother, Stephen, who was his finance minister. Um, as I mentioned on the previous program, Talbot inherited a financial crisis in the early 70s, with the drop in raw material prices and the energy crunch. And to counteract that, he developed these self-reliance programs where the people themselves would fund their own, local communities would fund their own infrastructure. This is called the Rally Time program. So local communities would raise money for their own infrastructure. They would build roads, hospitals, schools, clinics, airports, all needed infrastructure. And this was very successful in countering the effects of the downturn in rubber and iron ore prices and the energy crunch. And also President Talbot's brother Stephen, as finance minister, he renegotiated all the contracts, the foreign concession agreements, Firestone, the iron ore mining concession agreements, all the investment, foreign investment in Liberia was about 80% American. And because of these renegotiations, the country's revenue was increased. Just in the space of a few years, it almost doubled. And then they embarked on a project of industrialization, to wean the country off imports. And we decided to make our own, manufacture our own, our own needs. Processing sugar, processing rubber, manufacturing products made from rubber. We embarked on a project of industrialization. And this put us on a trajectory, toward an economic miracle. And yes, if the government had not been overthrown, today Liberia would be an entirely different country instead of President Trump's shitholes, as part of my expression. It would be on par with Singapore and India and Brazil and China and Hong Kong and just about anybody you can mention. Check the facts. I mean, all one has to do is look into the numbers in the 70s, from the 50s to the 70s. You see a clear trajectory toward an economic miracle.
All right, and then someone else is asking, Americans, Black Americans who are interested in getting citizenship in Liberia, is that how with George Weah in office? How's that process? Is it pretty tough? Well, marriage pretty much the best way, or some type of investment?
The best way to gain citizenship, or the way to gain citizenship, is through naturalization. And the citizenship laws are so confusing and so badly in need of reform that Liberians who took on foreign citizenship, like a lot of Liberians took American citizenship, throughout the years they lived here, first as permanent residents, they took American citizenship, and in that process, they lost their Liberian citizenship. The Liberian immigration nationality laws stipulate that if you take on another country's citizenship, you lose your Liberian citizenship. In order to regain that, you have to renounce that foreign citizenship and naturalize and become a naturalized Liberian. They don't recognize the dual citizenship. They don't recognize dual citizenship. Now, Liberia was founded for Black Americans, for African Americans. So, I mean, before the alien nationality laws of 1973, any African American or any Black person, any African from anywhere, was granted automatic Liberian citizenship. All he had to do was ask.
Oh wow!
Or declare the intent. 1970, 1973 laws changed that. You know, they demanded naturalization and forbid dual citizenship. So for anybody to become a citizen, whether the African American or Liberian who has taken on American citizenship, they have to go through the process of naturalization, which is not all that not that much a complicated process. Liberians in the diaspora are campaigning for dual citizenship, for the government to recognize, you know, that Liberians who took American citizenship are still Liberians. And it would be helpful if African Americans could join that fight for dual citizenship, and while demanding, you know, their right to Liberian citizenship, because they do have a right to it, African Americans. And if the combined forces, that could lead to positive change.
Okay. Are you familiar with the McGill family in Liberia?
Yes, I'm vaguely aware of them. I'm no expert on them. I know they were a prominent family, a prominent immigrant family who produced a lot of Liberia's leaders. Well, what about them? And I think this is Sophronia Fuller that you mentioned before.
No, Sophronia Powers. No, this is
Sophronia
from
Powers. I'm sorry.
This is actually from Professor Davis, our mutual friend, who's asking about the McGills.
McGill.
He said Blyton was educated by the McGill family in Liberia.
Oh. I wasn't aware of that. I know that Blyton went to Alexander High School, was the most prominent high school in most prominent institution of higher learning, you know, at that time before Liberia College was founded. He went to Alexander High School. I don't know if the McGills comprised part of the faculty in that institution or whether he was privately tutored by them. I'm not aware of his connection to the McGill family.
Okay. All right, cool. And then Baba Ajuma Ogunle McClellan wants to know, are you familiar with the role of the Gula Geechee people in the founding of Monrovia?
The Gula Geechee people played a role in the founding of Monrovia?
That's what he's asking. You know, maybe you can speak on that.
Oh, only in the sense that the Gula Geechee people, as most scholars agree, descended from people that lived in the border region between Liberia and Sierra Leone. The Gola people are mostly, you know, and a Liberian indigenous group, but the Geechee people are believed to come from the Kisi people of northwestern Liberia, who live on both sides of the Liberia-Sierra Leone border. Any role they might have played in the founding of Monrovia would be that there were surrogate rulers in that area, or, you know, they comprise part of the population of that area. Other than that, I don't, you know, I mean, being the Gola people and the Kis people. Other than that, I really don't know, you know, how the Gula Geechee people of Georgia and, I mean, the Sea Islands, and what was that, South Georgia, South Carolina, right? The Gula Geechee people.
South Carolina.
I don't see how they could have played a role in the founding of Liberia. I mean, but I can see how their ancestors might have.
Right. Okay. Let's see if we got any more questions. But yeah, just like I said, we wanted just to have this conversation tonight. You know, again, whenever Black Americans speak on returning to Africa or building our own autonomous nation, is, well, you can't do it because of Liberia. But when you really research Liberia, it was a successful nation before the coup. Oh, and this is the question I have. Can you go into detail in regard, and this is probably the last question. Can you go into detail in regards to the was it the rice riots?
Okay. The rice riots occurred in April 1979.
Okay.
And what happened was the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, an opposition group founded in New York City,
Mm-hmm.
transplanted to Liberia, on the invitation of President Talbot in the 1970s,
Mm-hmm.
and which was a mistake because the Progressive Alliance of Liberia was basically agents, foreign agents, bent on destabilizing the country and preparing, the Talbot government for its overthrow.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they weren't interested in democratic reform, like the homegrown democratic reform opposition movement was, which was university students and college professors. They wanted the complete overthrow of the government. That's what they demanded. And the government called them foreign agents. The government said that they were, agents provocateurs bent on destabilizing the country. Now, they took advantage of Talbot's liberal political atmosphere,
Mm-hmm.
and when his agricultural minister proposed an increase in the price of rice in order to wean the country of imports to stimulate domestic production of rice, it was only a proposal. The agriculture minister only made a proposal. It hadn't been, there was no increase in the price of rice. But the Progressive Alliance of Liberia seized on that opportunity for destabilization. They called for a mass demonstration against that proposed increase in the price of rice. The government denied a permit for demonstration because by then the government had recognized that these people were, not progressives as they call themselves. They were foreign agents bent on destroying the country, destabilizing the country.
Mm-hmm.
So they denied the permit to demonstrate. And in order to force a confrontation with the government, because that's what they really wanted, was to force a confrontation with the government, they went ahead with the demonstration anyway. And the army refused to assist the police in keeping order. By then, the army had been indoctrinated by the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, and also the soldiers have been were traditionally disrespected, not adequately compensated and not recognized for the efforts on behalf of the country. They were alienated. The army was basically alienated from the Talbot government. He was not a military man like Tubman, and he kept the army basically at arm's length. He didn't trust them, basically. They were Tubman's people as far as he was concerned. So anyway, because of this alienation, the army refused to assist the police in keeping order. They actually participated in the looting in the riots. The demonstration turned into a riot when they attempted to march on Capitol Hill, where the mansion is. The seat of government is the mansion in Capitol Building, where the legislature meets. They attempted to march on Capitol Hill, and the police attempted to stop them. Whoever fired first is not clear, but people got killed. About 50 people lost their lives. And actually, a lot of people believe that was really a coup in the making, that demonstration.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't happen. Talbot loyalists succeeded in restoring order with the assistance of troops from Guinea. But Secretary sent troops to aid his brother in restoring order. But a year later, April 1980, early 1980, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia was recognized as a political party, as an opposition political party. They had to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court issued this historic ruling that recognized them as a political party. And instead of gearing up for the upcoming elections in 1983, they continued with the campaign of confrontation and destabilization. And they led a midnight march from the mansion demanding the resignation of the government and a general strike until the government resigned. So they were arrested for treason and sedition. And while they were in prison awaiting trial, supposedly Samuel Doe and his 16 enlisted men overthrew the Talbot government. So the rice riots was basically destabilization, part of the destabilization process that led up to the 1980 coup.
All right, so this is the last question, I promise. What role should Alexander Benedict Cummings play in the future of Liberia?
Alexander Cummings, his campaign was inspiring, you know, and I actually was a supporter, and the fact that he failed is attributable to several reasons, various reasons, but chief among them being popularity. I mean, he didn't come close to matching George Weah's popularity. And another reason I say Liberians are still not yet ready for democracy. I mean, Alexander Cummings was the clear choice for, to move the country forward, but they chose to Mr. Popularity. And that goes back to Liberians loving Tubman, appreciating Tubman, the benevolent dictator, more than Talbot was a progressive Democrat. Liberians, basically, the Liberian electorate basically gravitates towards the popular, popularity and generosity and charisma. That's one of the main reasons that Alexander Cummings lost to Opon, Mr. Weah. And I would hope that he would attempt to make his strive for more name recognition and try again. He should definitely play a larger role, in going forward. Whether he will in this administration is still up in the air, but I would hope that he would make another attempt in the future.
All right, cool. Well, I mean, that's everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody in the chat room, thank you for joining us as well. Brother Morgan, thank you for coming on. I'll let you go ahead and close out, and also tell everybody how to get in contact with you, and also tell them about your program, the Liberian the program that you started, the institution.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, in closing, I would just like to say, well, thanks for having me, first of all. And American interests, U.S. interests, played a large role in the founding of Liberia. Because of shipping interests, then it morphed into rubber in 1926 as alternative sources of rubber, because the British monopolized all the sources of rubber, especially in the Philippines. And then in World War II, the United States needed military bases close to the North African theater of operations. So Liberia again became important in regards to the United States interests. So even though sometimes America forgot about that Liberia existed and only remembered it when there was a tribal uprising, the need for alternative sources of rubber in World War II need for bases again cast Liberia as important to American interests, and then that's when American investment began to flow into Liberia, and technical assistance and build the airport and the free port and basically all our infrastructure. And the more investment, the more America was invested in the country, the more this country, the U.S. influence, meddled in Liberian politics. Being internal enemies of the state, of a Pan-African state, all contributed to the destruction of Liberia. It was destroyed because it was basically because it was success. It was a successful Pan-African venture in history. And if people take the time to research this history, they will see no reason for Black Americans to be ashamed, or any Africans to be ashamed of Liberia. All we will see is a source of pride for all African people. But anyway, I represent the Historical Preservation Society of Liberia, and our main objective is historical preservation and the promotion of a fair, balanced, and objective and comprehensive Liberian history. And a lot of Liberian scholars are working on presenting this more comprehensive history as an alternative to counter all the negative coverage that's all over the place. And we have a website, hbsol-liberia.net. hbsol is hbsol-liberia.net, and the Facebook page, Historical Preservation Society of Liberia. And there are a whole lot of scholars. I mean, since I founded this society back in 2011, we have attracted the attention of a lot of scholars and academics. I mean, people from Princeton and Harvard and, all over the place. There's a lot of interest in Liberian history, because a lot of it is I mean, people want to, like Frederick Starr, a lot of people want to see for themselves why this country is called a failure. But anyway, so there's a whole lot of interest. There's a whole lot of scholarship on that page, and we're doing a lot of work on, promoting a balanced view of a balanced history of Liberia, but we need more support. Once we establish the presence back home, as we hope to do later this year, an exhibition tour is being planned with a DVD, a video of a documentary of historic downtown Monrovia. Hopefully, we'll tour HBCUs and try to garner more interest and support and solicit funding for preservation purposes. But we can be contacted at hbsol.liberia@gmail.com, or just go on Facebook. Just visit us on Facebook, or by phone, 770-256-5723.
Say your number again, brother.
770-256-5723. And I really appreciate this new interest in Liberian history.
Oh, it's important.
Yes. And this healthy debate on whether African Americans, are to blame for the failure of Africa and Black America cooperation, or whether Liberia can be cited as a bad example of Pan-African unity.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the history, the opposite is true.
Absolutely.
Liberia should be cited as a positive example of Pan-African unity and Pan-African independent self-rule.
All right, cool, man.
Once again, thank you very, very much for having me.
Oh, no problem, man. And we'll definitely have you back on again. And like I said, I think Liberia is something that, especially coming from a Black American perspective, is something that should be covered extensively. But everybody, thank you for joining us. Make sure you like, share, subscribe if you're on this video, if you're not already subscribed. Also go to searchforhuru.com, go to dynasamira.com, go to amazon.com, search your name, Dyna Samira, please buy a book. Also, those that super chatted, thank you so much for contributing. Dyna Samira, search for Huru, the brother Tony Morgan. Until next time, which will be tomorrow, peace.